Hello, my name is Angelica Aguilar. I'm enrolled in Sociology 4385, and for my contemporary theory video brief, I decided to focus on one of Michel Foucault's theories.
So in this video brief, I will be prosecuting the work of Michel Foucault, with specific focus on his ideas regarding asylums and how their patients should be treated. Following this introduction, Section 2 will provide an overview of Foucault's perspective by giving in-depth context and information relating to his theory. For Section 3 of this presentation, I will be offering my prosecution of Foucault's ideas with respectable arguments and different points of view. Finally, in Section 4, I will conclude with a summary of the information presented, how said information was organized, and reiterating the main points to leave the audience with something to think about after the presentation draws to a close. The sources used for this presentation can be found at the end of the video. With that being said, let us begin the prosecution of Michel Foucault. As I previously stated, I am prosecuting Michel Foucault's ideas regarding asylums and the treatments of madmen. Michel Foucault is a very influential contemporary thinker with many theories regarding power and knowledge. However, in his book Madness and Civilization, he discusses asylums and their practices. More specifically, I will be arguing against the three principal means of moral synthesis. So as I stated previously, The Birth of the Asylum is adapted from Foucault's Madness and Civilization. It discusses the history, construction, and practices regarding asylums and its treatments. In this presentation, we will be specifically focusing on the three principal means of moral synthesis, which is silence, recognition by mirror, and perpetual judgment. My interpretation of the meaning of these three principles is that they are meant to be a cure for the mentally ill, and I will be arguing against them as such. In the book, it is stated that these principles were originally organized by a man referenced to as Pinel. So the first principle mean is silence, and basically it's when peers are encouraged to abuse the use of silence in hopes to exclude and shun patients. The use of silence is really just trying to bring attention to the performance that patients put on when they are given an audience. So the idea behind this is if you take away the audience, then the performances will quit. I have some supporting quotes. The first reads, "Ordered expressly that everyone imitate his own reserve and not address a word to this poor madman." So, taking away the audience, in turn, should take away the performance. The second supporting quote says, "The guilt shifted inside, showing the madman that he was fascinated by nothing but his own presumption." So again, this is feeding into the idea that without an audience, and the patient being completely ignored and pushed to the side and excluded, that he will come to his wits and realize that there was nothing, and he was fascinated by nothing but his own presumption. So the second principal mean is recognition by mirror. This one is a little more interesting and a little different. So it uses similar peers and labels them as mad to make a point to the mad individual. And it has two phases. So it can either be used in the first phase, which is exultation, and it causes extreme happiness, or it can be used in the second phase, abasement, and it's degrading and humiliating. So an example of the first phase would be from the book. There were these three men who believed that they were all three the same king. So, and they were arguing about it, and the doctor pulled one of them aside and was like, why would you argue with these mad men who think that they are the king when you know you are the king? And so that individual that the doctor pulled aside started looking down on them, being like, yeah, they're mad and I'm right. So it resulted in the individual being validated and feeling good about themselves. But in the second example, for using the second phase, a similar situation happened, and it ended up in the complete opposite way. The patient was like, well, if they're mad and they think the same thing as me, what does that make me? And so it caused a lot of turmoil and basically just humiliated the patient. So I have these two supporting quotes. The first says, "Madness is made to observe itself, but in others, it appears in them as absurd." So basically, that quote supports the second phase, abasement, when it's just in themselves, it's fine, but when it appears to them in the form of a mirror and they see it for their own eyes, they think, oh, that person's crazy. And the second quote, states, observation operated only within the space defined by madness. Madness would be seen by itself. So that's basically the whole idea behind the second principle mean, is that if you can see someone who is similar to you and recognize that there's something wrong with them, or that they are quote unquote mad, then you will finally be able to see that you yourself are mad. And that is the whole idea behind recognition by mirror. So the third principle mean, which is perpetual judgment, is a little more complicated than the first two. It's when authority figures serve as a stream of consciousness for the patient, staying present in the mind of the madman as a way to control them and their actions, which I prefer, instead of control, I prefer to say dictate, because the authority figure in the patient's mind serves as somewhat of a judge. So this is kind of a long supporting quote, but I would like to read it. It says, everything was organized so that the madman would recognize himself in a world of judgment that enveloped him on all sides. He must know that he is watched, judged, and condemned. From transgression to punishment, the connection must be evident, as guilt is recognized by all. So what this quote is trying to say is that the mentally ill patient, must feel that they are being watched and judged at all times to dictate their behavior. So in the patient's head, there must be the authority figure that is judging them and dictating their actions and their feelings and everything, so that they make the best choice, which is not always what they believe to be the best choices because of their mental illness. So that's basically what perpetual judgment is. It's just a judge inside the patient's head telling them what's right and what's wrong. So before we move on to the prosecution, I would first like to explain my interpretations of each of these principal means, because I want the audience to understand my basis and my knowledge of these three principal means and what I am arguing. So in case I have misinterpreted at all, I would like to share my interpretation so you understand what exactly I'm arguing against. So for the first perspective, silence, I understand it to be, once the madman is left isolated, humiliated, and to their own devices, they will quit performing or acting out and hence be cured. For recognition by mirror, the madmen do not realize they are mad until they perceive similar peers as such. And then for perpetual judgment, the doctor serves as a mental compass or universe of judgment and should be feared more than the patient's delusions. These are what I believe these perspectives and principles to be, and these are what I will be arguing. So we have made it to section 3, the prosecution. So I believe that no matter what mental disorder one has, they should not be treated in the manner that Foucault speaks of, especially if the end goal is being cured. One should not be forced into treatment unless they cause harm to themselves or others. There is no need to shame, guilt, and condemn individuals for things that they are unable to control. The indignities caused by these principles are harmful and therefore unethical. I am a social work major, so all of these principles really just set red flags. Take it with a grain of salt, because I know this was in the 1980s and things have definitely changed since then, but in my opinion, they are just super unethical and very harmful and can just do a lot of damage to the patients themselves, as well as their mental well-being, and just all around it could cause a lot of problems in my opinion. So now that I have shared my prosecution, I would like to dive a little deeper and pick each principle mean apart piece by piece and specifically state why I disagree with them. So in the case of silence, which is the first principle mean, it encourages victim blaming and perpetuates the stigma that the patient is broken and needs to be fixed. I greatly disagree with this stigma. I don't believe that every single patient, regardless of what kind of patient it is, whether it's in like an asylum or like just a therapy session, like I don't believe that every patient needs to be fixed. I don't believe that curing them of whatever is happening is always the correct outcome. Sometimes they're perfectly fine the way they are, and that's just their normal. And so others around them, even though it's not normal to the others, it's their normal. So unless they want to change it, it doesn't need to happen. That's just how I feel about it. And the supporting quote for this is, "And it is only at this point that a common language becomes possible again, insofar as it will be one of acknowledged guilt." So the acknowledged guilt goes into the victim blaming. It's putting all of the guilt and the shame onto the patient over something that they cannot control. So that is my first reason. And then my second reason is it's founded on shame and guilt. So the patient is excommunicated, ignored. They have no idea why. And put yourself in the shoes of a mental ill asylum patient. They already are lacking some capabilities, and so they won't understand what is happening as well as someone who has those capabilities. So it's just all around a bad situation, and it's unfair. So the supporting quote for the shame and guilt is, "Delivered from his chains, he is now chained by silence to transgression and to shame." I don't think there's anything to be shameful about or guilty about being mentally ill. That's just not how I perceive it. It's not how I think of it. I don't think there should be a stigma around it, no matter what, no matter how drastic it is. So that's just me personally. So that is why I disagree with silence. Moving forward to recognition by mirror. My first reason is it inspires intolerance of others by making the individual believe that their peers are beneath them. It specifically for the first phase, which was exaltation, it really just does not promote harmony, and it makes the individual feel better by putting others down, and I can't agree with that personally. So the supporting quote is, "Flattered by his homage, the madman immediately withdrew, glancing at the others with a disdainful hauteur." So disdain, that's not a very good way to look at someone. And so the patient was really looking at these other patients. This quote is from the previous example the Three Kings. So when the doctor told the patient, like, why would you listen to these madmen, it put him down. And like I said, no matter how drastic a mental illness is, it shouldn't be shamed even by the mentally ill. So that's just how I feel about it. And the second reason is it can potentially create a negative self-image. So this one goes specifically with the second phase, which was abasement. And my supporting quote is kind of long, but it states, "Awareness was now linked to the shame of being identical to that other, of being compromised in him, and of already despising oneself before being able to recognize or to know oneself." So automatically, from that second example, that it made him humiliated. He was like, if they're mad, then what does that make me? He did not realize that he was mad, but he knew that he was similar. So it just automatically puts a connotation on the person's being and their identity, and I do not agree with that. It just has negative outcomes surrounding self-image, and it's really, all three of these are really just shame and guilt, and they're just very negative. So that is my second reason. And finally, my disagreements with perpetual judgment. The first one is it uses fear and punishment as motivators. Having a constant judge in your head, whether mentally ill or not, can be so draining, and it's just a lot of baggage. It's a lot of mental baggage that I feel like mentally ill patients just don't need. They already have what's going on in their head. They have all of their limitations. I just don't feel like, regardless of the outcome, the price isn't worth the reward, in my opinion. So my supporting quote is, "The asylum as a judicial instance recognized no other. It possessed its own instruments of punishment and used them how it saw fit." So this quote basically said, I read this quote as the asylum is going to punish them no matter what the circumstances is, however they feel, however the doctors feel, however, just doesn't matter the circumstance, they're going to do it however they see fit. So I didn't like that. I can't agree with that, especially like punishing someone for something they can't control. It just doesn't strike me as a positive situation, and that is why I have to disagree with it. Also, it calls for repeated torment of mentally ill patients. I cannot agree with this either. It kind of sounds crazy coming out of my mouth, like hearing it. And this quote is also kind of long, but it states, "This punishment, repeated as often as necessary, the recognition of transgression by its repression. All this must end in the internalization of juridical instance. It is only at this point that the judge agrees to stop the punishment, certain that it will continue indefinitely in the inmate's conscience." So just putting myself in a mentally ill patient's shoes, being afraid, constantly afraid of a judge in my head at all times, the paranoia that must come with that, it blows my mind that this was actually something that happened and something that was practiced. It really just strikes as unethical. I can't find a single ethical part about this. And it's punishment. They're punishing individuals for things that they cannot control. They did not choose to be mentally ill. They did not choose to believe themselves as kings. They did not choose to do any of this, yet they are being punished. It blows my mind, and I don't agree with it. So that is my disagreements with perpetual judgment. Now, I will give credit where credit is due. There are some pros to these principal means. The first pro is that it is very treatment focused. It's very focused on curing these people. And that kind of goes along with the second one. There is satisfactory results. It does work. For silence, the quote says, "Finally, they saw him come to his own accord to join the society of other patients. Henceforth, he returned to more sensible and true ideas." So the silence did end up having an effect, and it did work for recognition by mirror. This is I used the same quote earlier. It says, "Flattered by his homage, the madman immediately withdrew, and thus in an instant there was no longer remained any trace of an argument." So it did work. And then for perpetual judgment, "We profit from the circumstance of the bath, and with the aid of a faucet suddenly release a shower of cold water upon his head, which often disconcerts the madman or drives out the predominant idea by a strong and unexpected impression." So this quote was taken from an example where they used cold showers as a punishment, and it worked. It had satisfactory results. So I will give credit where credit is due. There are some pros. However, the cons, in my opinion, outweigh the pros. So here are the cons that I was speaking of. The first one is pretty much what I've been saying this whole presentation. It focuses on shame and judgment, which I don't think we should have that attitude towards mentally ill patients, especially over things that they cannot control. The second one is negative views regarding patients. The fact that Foucault insinuates that they are broken and need to be fixed, that just automatically strikes me as they see the patients as less than, and I just don't agree with that. It has a repressive thought process, which kind of goes along with the negative views. It really puts down the patients and reinforces that stigma that there is something wrong with them and they do need to be fixed, which they don't. If it's their normal and they're not hurting anyone, I don't see the problem. It has a lack of respect for patients' mental status, specifically with the reflection by mirror, the second phase of abasement. It really just tears them down. It does nothing but tear them down. It's negative. It does not reinforce any positives or have any silver lining of any sort. It just pulls them down. It makes them feel bad about themselves. And that on top of being mentally ill, I just don't see that as an appropriate way of going about the situation. And lastly, the power dynamics. This is more specifically for the third principle, meaning perpetual judgment. It seems uncomfortable to me. There's a lot of power dynamics at play. The patient and the doctor, the judge, the authority figure. I don't know how ethical that is.
specifically for mentally ill patients, or in general. I don't see how ethical that is. And it strikes as a red flag, and I just don't know if I can support something like that. So those are the cons that I have found. So to wrap up this section, I found this quote, and it really just encaptures why I disagree with all of these principal means. The quote states, "Madness will be punished in the asylum even if it is innocent outside of it." And this concept it's just crazy to me, because not even only for punishing, it's not even just about that. It's the fact that even if it's harmless outside of the asylum and outside of whatever setting, it will still be punished. And I don't understand the logic behind it. I don't know how they rationalize that. And it was just a really powerful quote that spoke to me and really just just solidified why I disagree. And so I just wanted to include it here before I wrapped up this section because I thought it was a very good quote to include, and I feel like it wraps up exactly what I've been trying to say. So as we reach the conclusion, I just wanted to wrap up what was discussed during this presentation and how mine and Foucault's ideas clash, and really why I just disagree. In regards to the patients, I believe that it is okay to be as they are, as long as no one's harmed, as long as they're not harming themselves or others. I don't see the need to be cured. I don't see the problem. And Foucault, as he's demonstrated, sees and feels that they need to be fixed or cured, and I don't agree. Treatment-wise, I think that they should be respected just as much as any quote-unquote sane person. I feel like their mental illness has no basis and no effect on their worth as a human being. And so I think it should be respectful and dignified, even if they are different from the norm. And Foucault focuses on condemnation, shame, and guilt. Those are the three factors that go into all of these practices and quote-unquote treatments. And then for the measures, I understand that there are some differently abled people and it is out of their control. And Foucault, as is stated, he wants to punish them for being different. He wants to change them. He wants to control them. And I just can't agree with that. So these are the ideas as they are now and as they've been presented. And just wanted to wrap that up. As for the closing statement, the indignities that Foucault's beliefs perpetuate are unacceptable and unethical, so they should be argued against, which is why I decided to prosecute them. Because, as I've stated many times, they, in my opinion, are very unethical. And like I said, take it with a grain of salt because I know this was from 1984, but it's really unethical, and I hope that they are not still in place. So with that being said, here is my reference page, and thank you so much for watching. I hope that this was entertaining and you learned something, and maybe I changed your way of thinking just a little bit. Thank you so much.